Okay, for our next speaker, we are going back on land. We are now hearing from Sean O'Donnell, who is a professor in the Department of Biodiversity, Earth, and Environmental Science, as well as Biology at Drexel University, where he is using tools from thermal physiology, brain plasticity, and evolution to study social insects, especially army ants. Welcome, Sean.
There we go. Microsoft finds its way eventually. Okay, so I'm going to start with a disclaimer, which is I do in my lab, we do a lot of different stuff. We do focus pretty heavily on social insects. I've done a lot of work on brain plasticity and brain evolution, relating it to behavior. I've done a lot of work on thermal physiology. I have not worked on putting those two things together myself. So when I was invited to speak here, my brain kind of seized up a little bit. Then I thought it through, and I realized that I developed some theory with a former student of mine, Caitlin Baudier, who I'm putting on here as a co-author, so I don't have to thank her at the end, and realized that some theory that we developed for social insects might have broader implications and actually could be a way of connecting neurobiology to climate change. So this is the arrogant version of the talk title. This is the maybe more accurate version. Is it hot in here, or is it just me thinking about how nervous systems accommodate differing thermal physiologies among social partners? So this is going to be an idea talk. So to set up the framework, social behavior is present in some form in the vast majority of animal species. And social groups can, at least sometimes, include members that have differing thermal physiology. So here's an imaginary kind of classic example of a thermal performance diagram. We collect data like this in my lab a lot on insects. And so if you measure some aspect of performance, ultimately, of course, what you'd be interested in getting at is fitness, and then you plot that against some measure of environmental temperature, you might develop a curve that looks like this. So what the idea is here basically that you're going to have potentially within a society, right, within a social group, robust individuals and more vulnerable individuals. And they could differ from each other in different aspects of their thermal physiology. So the data that I'm going to present are going to focus on maximum ability to accommodate temperatures, in some cases at both high and low ends, in other cases just at the high end. So CT max might differ between these individuals. Their thermal optima could differ, whatever your preferred measure of physiological performance should work in this framework. Okay, so social interactions range very widely in duration and in the fitness impact on the participants. But I believe that potentially at least these ideas could apply across all of this variation. So just to give some examples of the kinds of variation or the kinds of categories of social interactions that animals engage in. If you're a sexual reproducer, at least for some short period of time, could be 10 seconds if you're a flying mosquito, you're engaging in mating pairs, parents and offspring, siblings, prides or packs, cooperative or communal breeders, and superorganisms or colonies. And I'm going to focus in on these two levels just because I think these are the ones where we know the most about individual differences in thermal physiology within the social groups. But again, I think my idea is that these ideas are potentially relevant in all of these social contexts. So this is probably the most obvious one. Adults and immatures, parents and offspring. Just in general, right, young animals are likely to be more thermally vulnerable in many taxa. So here are two very widely divergent groups of animals, bumblebees that spend a lot of their time and energy incubating the babies, the broods in their nest. Any of you who are fans of eagle cams, right, will have seen, this kind of image, right? I just look at this and I think, I thought being a parent of young children was rough. Boy, I didn't go through anything. Okay, so superorganisms and colonies. Now, this, of course, is Caitlin and my entry into thinking about this. And so the ideas are particularly, that I'm going to talk about, are particularly in the case where you've got a diverse worker force in a colony, subcastes, that have to coordinate in order to complete some kind of a job. So you've got diverse individuals that have diverse thermal physiology, but you need them to work together. And that's the kind of the situation that sets up the potential challenge. So what we find is that there are body size related thermal physiology differences among the workers in some species of ants, as a group that I'll show the data for. So our work on army ants are interesting because the worker force comes in 4 different flavors. Basically, there are 4 different size-related, morphologically distinct subcastes that perform different jobs for the colony, and it turns out that they differ significantly from each other in thermal physiology. So going from the smallest minims up to the largest soldiers, maximum thermal tolerance, CT max plotted here, kind of shows the pattern you might expect. The smaller individuals are more thermally vulnerable than the larger individuals. Interestingly, for CT min, the minimum temperature that the individuals can tolerate, the pattern is more complex. These are data from leafcutter ants, where again we see a significant relationship. Now here the variation is not discrete. Leafcutters vary continuously in body size, but still show these relationships between size and task performance. And there are significant relationships between body size here measured as head width, and again, we're only looking at CT max in this case, right, highest tolerated temperature. And then there are interesting complications superimposed on the body size effect here. Sampling these ants from different geographic locations, we see that the strength of the relationship between size and thermal tolerance varies geographically with climate. And that in a way is a complication, but also I think a really exciting opportunity for exploring how social interactions affect thermal physiology. Okay, so from these observations, we developed what we called weak link theory. And so here are some predictions we might make when you need to have these thermally distinct or physiologically distinct workers coordinate to perform tasks. So we could imagine if you've got thermally non-challenging environments and thermally challenging environments, if all of the workers avoid the environments that would be harmful to the most vulnerable individuals, then the cost to the group is missed opportunities. If the robust workers will work in these conditions and the more vulnerable or weak link workers will not, then presumably there's going to be a cost to reduced in the form of reduced group performance or partially missed opportunities. And then perhaps the vulnerable individuals remain coordinated or integrated with their robust nestmates, expose themselves to challenging thermal conditions, and then the cost is potentially harm to the vulnerable workers. So what Caitlin and I realized is that we could generalize these ideas across animal social variation, and so that's what I want to explore here, and possibly beyond. So I will actually touch a little bit on ecology at the end, if I have enough time. Okay, so one question: do partners converge in their behavior or performance on a thermal midpoint, or does one partner behave so as to track the thermal physiology of the other partner? If it's the latter, who gives in? So our simple prediction might be that the robust partners will track the vulnerable partner's needs. However, there can be asymmetries in social need or social control among the partners in a group. And parents and offspring and simultaneous siblings, I think, are really interesting examples of this. So there are potential conflicts of interest over what the appropriate thermal responses should be. So nobody gets that reference. Nice pina colada for your kids. Okay, so a fundamental question for neurobiologists. Self-thermal sensation is well documented. How do animals sense their partners differing thermal needs? Well, the null hypothesis is that they don't, right? But I think if this is the case, then disruption of social groups or social group performance might be an additional and important negative impact of changing climates, for example, global warming. Another possibility is a mismatch. So if there's a fixed rule, an animal's thermal sensation or other neural responses might be set to the physiology of their partners rather than to themselves. I don't think that's terribly likely, but we certainly can't rule it out a priori. Plastic responses. If you've got a system where there are reliable indicators of variation in thermal physiology that animals can clue into, then they might use rules of thumb to adjust how an animal might use a rule of thumb to adjust how it performs. And so one possibility is that they make a physiological adjustment to changes in conditions. It could be a seasonal indicator. It could be actually detecting a social event like egg laying, hatching, birth, whatever. Another possibility is that there could be flexible, short-term, likely behavioral responses to the thermal environment that accommodate partners rather than yourself when the partners are present, and then you can turn it off when they're not present. This is where I think it gets more exciting and interesting, is the possibility that there's signaling, so a capacity to flexibly detect and respond to thermal stress in partners rather than using a rule of thumb that you're anticipating what their thermal physiology is. So what are the cues? Well, one possibility is some form of malaise. Possibly animals are observing active thermal regulation in social partners. The most exciting possibility, I think, to me, is the potential for there being actual evolved displays. So, for example, heat stress-related calls or pheromones or displays in some other sensory modality where individuals are communicating their thermal stress to social partners. How do animals decide which partners to attend to? In some social contexts, kin selection seems like an attractive idea for how you could pull this off, degree of relatedness. That's not always going to be relevant. Not all social systems are based on kinship. You can have unrelated mates, unrelated cooperative breeding partners, and in insect societies, nepotism is generally disfavored, so we probably don't expect genetic variation to be associated with variation in thermal accommodation within an insect colony. We can take that idea even further and apply it potentially, though, beyond social intraspecific interactions to interspecific interactions. So when you've got partnerships or symbioses, the partners that can potentially be, very phylogenetically distant from each other may actually be selected to accommodate each other's thermal physiology. And then to close, when I teach about positive cooperative interactions in my animal behavior course, every topic I end up going through, ending up with talking about cheaters, and I'm going to do that again here, right? So these are just some ideas about how cheaters could invade these kinds of interactions. So one possibility, of course, is that parasites could manipulate the thermal biology of their hosts. I realized late after using this as the example that there's not a nervous system in one of those partners, but there is in the other, so we'll keep it in here. Can natural enemies, parasites or predators, anticipate the thermal needs of hosts or prey to increase their attack success? Another interesting possibility is that enemies or predators could induce thermal stress in order to disable more thermally vulnerable prey. So I'm using a lizard on a hot day hiding in a crack as a possible context for both of these kinds of interactions. So I'm out of time, and that's the end. So I'd like to thank all of you for listening, staying with me, getting towards lunchtime, and I'd like to thank the organizers very much for inviting me and providing this fantastic opportunity for all of us.
Are there any questions for sure? Yeah, Matthew.
Okay, great talk. These are really interesting questions. So I'm curious if you look at different species of eusocial insects, whether you observe differences in caste structure, like social organization of the colonies, in species that are adapted to like more environments that are more stable versus more fluctuating environments that maybe suggest that there's maybe some aspect of their social
Yeah.
behavior that is modulated.
That's actually a super cool question. So like you could imagine that these kinds of forces might, for example, select against variation in thermal physiology. One thing that is interesting. I don't know. I didn't really have time to go through the leafcutter ant data in great detail, but one thing that was super cool about it was, as you'd expect, at the warmer sites, maximum thermal tolerance was elevated, right? So if you live in a hot place, you can stand hotter temperatures. But also the steepness of the relationship between body size and thermal physiology varied among sites. So the gradient was much steeper at the cooler, high elevation site. So that suggests the possibility that not that the small workers have disappeared, they still have the variability in worker body size and behavior, but thermal physiology of the most vulnerable individuals seems to have been tweaked the most. So that kind of supports, I think, in a way, what you're asking about.
I'm thinking of like extreme environments, since you just mentioned this, like Cataglyphus ants, like in the desert
Yeah.
or so, where you have, I don't know anything about the structure in the like inside, but they go out and they find food sources in like 45 degrees Celsius
Yeah,
or
they're
hotter.
amazing. Yeah.
And so that could be maybe an example where you have like the sacrifice idea, that the ones that go out sacrifice them in a way for the ones that stay in the nest. I don't know, it's just thought.
I mean, I think one thing that's cool there is, Cataglyphus do seem to be exploiting the thermal sensitivities of their prey, because what they're specializing on is going out and finding insects that have fried because they stayed out too long, in the sun. I don't know a whole lot about variation in thermal tolerance within Cataglyphus societies, so it's an interesting question. Yeah. Yeah.
That was really interesting talk. I'm wondering if in the ants, whether you look to see whether individual ants can read the behavior of other ants and
Yeah.
respond differently. And just adding a remark to that, that would almost suggest that it's like an ancestral form of empathy.
Yeah. I think in a way it is. I was almost going to put like an image of mind reading, right? Because in a way that's sort of, you're sort of asking a nervous system to respond to the needs of another individual, right? In a way you can think of that as a form of empathy if you don't put all the baggage on top of it. One thing that is cool, like including army ants, right? The species that I showed the data on here, it's recently been shown that they do engage in wound care and healing behavior, like has been documented in the African termite hunting ants. We don't know whether or how that translates into responses among the subcastes to thermal stress. So that's something that we're really interested in, hopefully getting a chance to study eventually.
Okay.
Thanks.
If there are no more questions, let's thank Shaw. Thank you.